you really need to consider. So water's flavored by a lot of things. You got the bad things, the chlorine, pond scum, the eggy hydrogen sulfide, metallic iron, that kind of stuff. You don't really want those things in your beer. But then there's also good things like, sodium and chloride, sulfate, magnesium, all those other things that we typically talk about in water chemistry. But the problem is that their presence or absence doesn't make the water suited for brewing. There's more to it than that. So you can't really taste what makes suited for brewing. You can't rely on taste. You have to actually know what the chemistry is and go from there. So even with that, when you're brewing different beers, you got something very pale or something very dark. Well, the water chemistry requirements for that change. So you got to know how those goalposts move, and you need to know how to actually make the water work for your brew. So let's get to it. And of course, there is a wide spectrum of beer, all the way from the palest to the darkest, and the water chemistry requirements can be quite varied between them. So, and of course, I know that the answer is yes, you do want to brew a wide variety of beers because you're probably not, interested in drinking, mega lager or whatever. So let's get to it. But you have to know how to learn, or you need to learn how to work with your water in order to get there. So why are we caring about water? Well, first of all, it's a major component of beer, and it affects every other component of beer. And by that, I mean the malt, the hops, the yeast. So let's look at each one of those. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Bad water and malt, things like you can end up extracting more tannins and silicates out of the husks and material, the grain material. Both of those are very harsh flavored in tasting. Bad water and malt impedes the starch conversion. You have to have the right pH in order to get a proper and desirable starch conversion. These last 2 points are something that a lot of judges see right away. You'll have a dulling of the beer flavor if your pH isn't low enough. The same thing goes if your pH isn't low enough, your beer wort will undoubtedly be darker. I like to say that a lot of times you get some of these pale styles like Witts and Hefeweizens, and you end up with a gray looking beer as you're pouring it while you're at the judging table, and you're saying, oh, I know what this is going to be. And 90% of the time it's true. So bad water and malt doesn't work. Bad water and hops too is a problem. You can end up extracting some of those green polyphenols out of your hop charge. It certainly creates a harsher bitterness to your beer. And overall, it does alter the hop flavor. So it's important that your water be correct for that reason. And then with respect to bad water and yeast, well, first of all, it does interfere with flocculation. Yeast have a point of zero charge, and as the beer pH drops, that assists with flocculation. But if your yeast didn't get the opportunity or could not bring the beer pH down, you end up with a poor looking beer. And then that whole issue, one of the antimicrobial actions of yeast is that it decreases pH. But if your wort started with a very high pH and your yeast has to work extra hard and extra long, and your wort ends up being at a higher pH for a longer period of time, that introduces the greater possibility that beer spoilers could invade your wort and screw up your whole beer. So yeah, there are definitely reasons why you want to be, paying attention to the water chemistry. So care about your water. It affects everything in your beer. So I'd like to say there's really two main water concerns. The first is the pH. The second is the mineral content. And of course, pH should be targeted. And I like to get pH typically in the 5.2 to 5.6 range. Getting it up, beyond 5.6 can be a little bit problematic. But you can see that centers us right around the 5.4, and these are room temperature pHs, by the way. So that's something that you should consider when you're brewing. And one of the main reasons why achieving a proper pH in our beer is because, well, if you look at this map, all that light yellow area, well, that's the high alkalinity surface waters that are present in the United States. And as you can see, there are areas of brown, and those are the very non-alkaline waters. In essence, mountain runoff. You'll notice that we've got the Rockies over here, and we've got the Appalachians over on the East Coast, and you've got that potentially low alkalinity water. But for, what is it? Probably 90% of us, we're dealing with, alkaline water that's going to be working against the lowered pH that we really do want. So just recognize that we're being dealt a bad hand here, and we have to take action. So an important fact for everybody to consider: all brewing requires an acid of some form. So let's look at how we can create the acid in the mash. The first way we can do that is to add crystal or roast malts. Either one of these tends to be more acidic than the typical base malt. Base malts tend to produce a distilled water pH in the high 5 range, but these roast malts, they could easily be down in the 4.5 range. Crystal malts, it depends on what color they are, but they are an acidifier. We can also add calcium or magnesium salts, and they work quite effectively. But of course, you're also getting another anion in there, and in some cases that may not be a good thing, and especially for the tap water that you guys deal with, because it's already kind of mineralized. And then there's always the brute force way, by adding a liquid acid or an acid malt, and that can drive pH down and neutralize alkalinity pretty handily. So, like I said, all brewing water does need treatment, and some need it more than others. Even RO and distilled water still requires treatment. In some cases, we need to add acid still, or we need to add an alkaline in order to keep the pH from dropping too low. And for you extract brewers out there, I highly recommend that you're using RO or distilled water to reconstitute your extract, because if you end up using, for instance, your tap waters, they can tend to be, first of all, alkaline, and that can drive up the pH of your reconstituted extract wort. The other thing is that you could add in more ionic content that can drive your flavor maybe in the direction that you don't really want it to go. So just a consideration. And then of course you Bruin or baggers and no spargers, yeah, you still got to treat your water. So don't ignore it. And some people like to say, well, early brewers, they didn't worry about water. Well, yeah, they did. So let's look at the ways that they achieved the kind of pH adjustments that they needed to do. So first of all, when you've got a water that has a high degree of temporary hardness, you can pre-boil that water and get the chalk to actually drop out of solution as a precipitate in the bottom of your pot. You can pull off that decanted water after it's cleared, and it will have lower alkalinity and lower calcium content. So that's one way. Lime softening is another similar way, but we're doing it chemically by driving pH very high, which causes the things like alkalinity and the calcium content to actually precipitate again, just like with the pre-boiling. Another method that brewers used to do was an acid rest. They would put the grain in, raise the temperature of the ton, into the, say, 100-degree range, and of course, those of you who have dealt with Berliner Weisses or things like that, dealing with the lactobacillus, that's their sweet spot. And, it doesn't take too long for them to spew a bunch of lactic acid out and actually, neutralize what could be excessive alkalinity in water. And of course, acid malt, that's typical just lactic acid on a pale malt, or sour gut, which is in essence, an lactic acidified wort, which when you're adding that to the water, well, guess what? It also takes out the alkalinity. So how to treat? It's really not that difficult, and you should consider it if you aren't already. So what do you do? Well, the first thing that you need to do is find out what's in your water. Water company reports are helpful. Test lab report is even more helpful. Of course, if your water supply quality varies over time, well, it makes it tougher. And then, of course, there are home test kits that can also assist in you kind of figuring out what's going on with your water. And by home test kits, I mean like something as simple as a cheap aquarium test kit. You've got the calcium test kits so that you can, at least give you a ballpark number of where your calcium content is. And then carbonate hardness, which is in essence alkalinity. So in between these two tests, you've got what you need to do the lion's share of information that you'll need for brewing, at least with respect to mash pH. So what next? Well, let's look at the water that a lot of you people are dealing with regard to your tap water. So I've reviewed some of the water reports, Escondido, Carlsbad, some of the other towns in your area. I kind of deduced that it looks like, your calcium content really isn't that terribly high, 37 parts per million, plus or minus 5 ppm, magnesium, 15 ppm, which again, isn't terrible. The sodium is just a teeny bit higher than maybe you might want, but it's not really a problem. Your sulfate, 105 ppm, I can understand why a lot of people or why San Diego is known for its IPAs, because with the elevated sulfate and chloride, it's easy to use this water to make a pretty good IPA, especially when you're typically adding a little more sulfate and possibly chloride. So it's not, it's a good starting point with that respect. And then the bicarbonate content at 115 parts per million really isn't that bad. Easily neutralizable with an acid addition or whatever. So overall, North County water is not a bad starting point. Probably the thing that's more problematic is that it sometimes changes because of quality, changes in sources and changes in water quality for those sources. So just a consideration. So a little too mineralized for some styles, but perfectly fine for others. So I know that you can make good beer there because I've had it. So what next? So using a calculator to guide your water additions, and let's go there now. And if I can figure out how to get out of, let me see here. And let me bring this back up. There we go. And I'm not sure if I'm sharing my screen with you at the moment or not. I need to find out what's going on here. Andy, oh, here we go.
It's good. You're not in presentation mode, but we can see your screen.
Oh, you can see, so you see the Bru'n Water screen at the moment?
We see the, no, we're just seeing the globe. We're seeing the Earth.
Oh, okay, I need to undo this. Okay, how do I close out?
You can do share. If you do share screen, you can share a new screen.
Well,
or you can unshare this one.
Well, I am trying, here we go.
Press on the share screen button. It'll give you an option to share a new screen.
There we go. Okay. Now, did it change?
Not yet. There we go. We got it.
Good. Okay. So let's talk about Bru'n Water real quick. First of all, Bru'n Water is not exactly a super easy program when you first get started. So my strongest recommendation for everybody, please read the instructions. With about 5 minutes running through these instructions, you'll be good to go. And after you understand what the program flow is and what you're doing with it. Okay, let's move on.
Say, Martin, I did go through that, and I got to say that's the most in-depth instructions I've ever seen on anything. There's a lot of information in there. Just the information in those instructions, that's like, value right there. Just if you read that, you're going to learn a lot just from that.
Yeah, but I'm amazed at how many people, that they're not going to be bothered with that. And yet for Bru'n Water, you really have to. Okay, so the next hurdle for most brewers using Bru'n Water, they'll get to this water report input, and then they'll put in stuff, and they'll be going along, and the water report said to do this, and you're going through, and the report down here says the water report is unbalanced, and oh, I'm pulling my hair out. Why is it not right? Well, most other water programs don't even give you the benefit of this. They let you just put in whatever you want, and it spits out a number. And in fact, Bru'n Water will also spit out a number. It will be wrong, but at least Bru'n Water right here is telling you, hey, there's a problem. So that's one of the things that I think that all water programs should incorporate, and I'm not positive that all of them do. So let's just keep that in mind. That just means that you have to do a little more homework and maybe some conversions. And for some of the typical water report formats, I provide many conversions here that hopefully get you to the kind of ionic outputs that we actually need to use in Bru'n Water. So it's not hopeless, but just recognize that when you're dealing with Bru'n Water, it's going to give you this warning, and yes, that might be a problem, but it means that you need to do a little more homework. And once you get it right, you're good. And for anybody who, so the water in where I live has like 250 parts per million sodium. So it's kind of salty, not ideal for brewing. So I do have an RO system, but and I would imagine that a lot of you guys also have RO water that you use or RO machine that you use. But go ahead and put in your tap water, because one of the good things about your tap water is that supplies alkalinity that you can then dial in a percentage of your tap water and actually, get the pH raising property that's kind of hard to do when you're starting with RO water. So anyhow, you're dealing with this water report input page probably once. Beyond that, you'll probably never come back here ever again. Same thing for this sparge acidification page. If you're dealing with RO water, well, first of all, RO water already has extremely low alkalinity, so you don't need to acidify your sparging water. If you're dealing with your tap water, well, again, you only need to, one of the things that you're trying to do with sparge water acidification is bring the alkalinity to preferably less than 25 parts per million as calcium carbonate. And once you've figured out what that dose is, per gallon of water, you're probably never going to come back to this page either. So then we're ready to go into the real meat of what Bru'n Water is in the 2 pages that you're going to be spending a lot of your time on. So first thing you have to do is enter your grain bill. You've got the opportunity to, well, at least, and of course, I'm showing you the supporters version. So it's got a few more bells and whistles that help brewers manage their brewing sessions and actually help them dial in a few more techniques that can be very helpful. So, you're putting in things like grain names over here, batch name. You're selecting a variety of different kinds of malts, base malts, wheat, oat malts, which are have a slightly higher pH than the typical base malt for the same color. You have crystal malts, which tend to be a little more acidic. And of course, you're going to be putting in your color rating over here to help with that. Roast malts, which tend to have sort of a constant degree of acidity without regard to the color of the malt. And then finally, you have acid malt. So through these inputs here, you establish what's in your grist, how much of each is in there, and what their colors are. And we just provide a little double check over here, so that you're probably using something like with Beersmith or Pro Mash or something like that, and you want to double check that. Hey, I think that my Pro Mash grain bill said I had 87% Pils malt in there, and I'm currently showing not that, so I better fix it. So there's a couple of things to look at here. Let's see. For American brewers, Lovabond is the typical unit, but there are Bru'n Water users around the world, and they like to use EBC. I don't know why anybody would typically use existing water or adjusted water, but that possibility is right there. Some people do like to delay the addition of their crystal malt or roast malt from the main mash, just so that they don't drive down their pH too low. Gordon Strong is a big advocate of this, and this version does provide allow you to input this, and you can actually see what the resulting pH is when you do that kind of activity. And at the moment, I don't have any. Well, let's bump the roast up here. And for instance, so you can see that the pH here is listed as 5.43. So if I reserve the roast malt out of the main mash, now the pH of the mash, the main mash, was raised to 5.89, which is kind of high. So you can see what the effect is when you do that. So these are things that you can play around with, and if it suits your brewing style, it's a handy thing to have. Okay, so grain bill input page, that's going to be a page that you're going to visit a lot.
So Martin, a question
Yes,
for you here. So is the idea to get, so you're being able to predict where your pH is going to land, so you can make sure that you make the appropriate adjustments. But is the idea that you're planning to try to get you in the ballpark, so that, and you would then, maybe if you brewed that beer again, you would know to adjust it, a little bit here or there? Or, I mean, are you trying to get exactly where you need to go with the spreadsheet?
Well, yeah. So you're dealing with a variable water supply. You're also dealing with natural ingredients that are not consistent, not exactly consistent. So for those reasons, you can't rely on this thing. There's no program that's going to get you consistently, within 100th or something like that. Bru'n Water, yeah, if you know the grains well and their acidity, you can typically get within 1/10 of a standard pH unit. So, as you mentioned, the goal is to get you in the ballpark. You don't have to be exact, but moreover, one of the things that I've found is that pH actually does vary during the mash. Typically, pH will be lower early in the mash, say at the 15-minute mark, and then it will rise another 1/10 or two throughout the duration and become relatively constant after roughly the 45-minute mark. So I typically, when I'm brewing, I'm measuring pH every 15 minutes. And over the 100+ trials, plus a set of controlled laboratory trials, I've seen that same response time and time again. There have been a very few, and I do mean very few, where the pH was a bit higher and then it actually went down. But for the most part, I do recommend that you monitor your pH. Don't be surprised if it's a little bit lower initially, and then it should rise hopefully towards your target. I've got Bru'n Water, the algorithms set such that it's more in line with the long term, say the 45-minute pH, and the constant pH. So that and that also reflects more what is going to go into the kettle, and in its kettle pH ultimately that is one of those driving factors. So don't worry too much about initial pH. Worry more about long-term and consistent pH.
So Martin, question for you on that, because so my understanding, the pH, getting the pH right is what you need for good starch conversion. But then you're talking about needing to get the pH right before it goes into the kettle. So what is the importance behind
well,
that?
But they are generally the same number. But so I recommend that you concentrate on that ending pH value, and making sure that it's in the proper range. And for most beers, that's that 5.2 to 5.6 range. I do find that for hot beers that have a high pills content, you definitely want to keep right on that 5.4 mark. That helps DMS reduction, or that helps SMM conversion to DMS and ultimately DMS reduction. For black beers, getting that pH upwards of 5.6 helps smooth those roast flavors. So that's a good thing. For some, say, wits and maybe Hefeweizens, you might want to go a little bit lower than 5.4, just to give them a head start in producing the tart, light notes that those styles tend to have. So just an idea. But as you mentioned, the idea is to get you in the ballpark so that you'll at least have a pretty good beer. A person like Gordon Strong will tell you that you really have to brew and rebrew a beer possibly 2 or 3 times in order to really tweak it. And what we're trying to do with Bru'n Water is to help you tweak very quickly, so that you're within the character and pH that you wanted right away. So that even that first batch is really good, but then you put on your judge hat, or you give it to your judge friends, and they say, well, it's just a little bit too tart or a little too harsh, and then with the information that you have, hopefully that you've gathered pH information, you can say, oh, well, Bru'n Water said, this was supposed to be a 5.42 pH, and it ended up at 5.48. Well, and my judge friend said, it was a little bit harsh, and not as lively as I really wanted. So, or they wanted. So, I need to dial that target pH another 3, 4, 5 hundredths down to get me down, and let's see where that ends up. So just a thought. Okay, so now we're on the water adjustment page, and you've got a lot to enter here. First thing that you'll do is figure out what sort of water profile do I want to aim for? And within Bru'n Water, there are a lot of selections. You've got all these historic brewing centers, including boiled versions of those waters. Remember, I mentioned to you one of the old treatment methods was pre-boiling the water. Well, I've provided boiled water estimates that show you what that kind of water might have ended up being. In addition, there's a bunch of Belgian waters, and one of the things that I like to tell people: don't necessarily brew to something like a Bru'n Water or a Dortmund water or something like that, but explore them. Look at what's in there. Well, let's go to say Munich water. So Munich water, here we are, kind of high calcium, 77 parts per million. Magnesium is a little bit high, actually very similar to what you've got in North County. Sodium very low, sulfate very low, chloride very low. The bicarbonate is very high because the aquifer in the southern Bavaria is very limestoney, and there's it's a hard alkaline water that we've got there. But you can see, with regard to the flavor producers, magnesium, sodium, sulfate, and chloride, all very low. And of course, Munich is known for lagers and Hefeweizens that have, the water definitely is firmly in the background. You get no character from the water, and you don't want any character from the water. It's all about the malt or the yeast. So looking at things like these water profiles give you an idea of what you're dealing with. Like here we are, the Vienna water profile. It's a little bit further down the Danube, and it's the water they're using is taken from along the banks of the Danube, and by God, there's a little more flavor ions in there, and you can see that maybe that's and here the sulfate is a little bit higher, and a good Vienna lager is actually a little bit drier. But by exploring these various profiles, you can actually get an idea of what those brewers were dealing with. Not that you're necessarily going to brew with them, but you at least understand what the effect is. Like, for instance, the Jever profile, which is one of the, Jever is a outstanding German pils. And here we go with 75 parts per million sulfate, 30 ppm chloride, makes a great dry German pils, really sharp and bitter, just the way a German pils should be. So let's move on. So that's that. Let's get out of there. And if I can get, there we go. Okay. And you can, of course, if you are brewing with distilled water or RO water, you can select that and dial up, say, for me, I typically take this to 100% because all of my brews are 100% RO. And I've already input the grain bill, so that's in there. Next thing is to input your mash and sparging water volumes so that you're adding the appropriate or you're calculating the proper additions over here for those waters. And so we've got this profile, and so I left it at the Jever profile, and now I need to, I've got RO water, and my RO water only has 1 part per million sulfate, and I know that I need to bump up the sulfate, and I'll try that with the gypsum. Well, that's a bit too much. So you keep trying, and it should only take a couple of seconds to figure out what it's going to take to bump these ion contents to the proper range. Well, let's add a little bit of chloride, and that also is going to bump our calcium up. As we saw, well, we don't need much in the way of magnesium, so I'm not going to bother with Epsom salt or magnesium chloride. I don't need much in the way of sodium, so I'm not going to bother with that. I'm really just worried about the sulfate and the chloride. And here I've got them reasonably close. And the good thing about when you're dealing with water chemistry, especially these flavor ions, you don't need to be exact. Plus or minus 10 parts per million is plenty close. And of course, within Bru'n Water, there's a bunch of ancillary data that's buried in here. I've got these little comments that help illustrate what you should be seeing and what you're targeting. So there's a bunch of helpful information buried in this sheet that can definitely make a difference. So there's a couple of interesting things over here on the side here. So let's look at them. Let me get out of here. Well, first of all, one of the things that I feel strongly about is a lot of brewing water programs typically assume that your calcium chloride is in its dihydrate form, which is not true. And in fact, it's actually an unconservative assumption. So for that reason, the free version of Bru'n Water, and typically I set mine to anhydrous, the anhydrous version of calcium chloride, because that means that I'm going to underdose my wort with chloride, because in my opinion, you always want to err on the side of lesser is better as opposed to adding more. So do less is my recommendation. So let me bump this up a little bit so you can see a little bit better. There's a couple of nice little features over here. The first one, add sparging water minerals to the mash. This is exceptionally helpful when you're doing something like a nice German lager, where you really don't want much in the way of mineralization in your water. You know, so if I went back up here and went back to the Munich profile, because I do really like brewing German lagers, but by God, it's very difficult to get the calcium content in the mash up where it needs to be in order to precipitate oxalate and still end up with low sulfate and chloride, which, remember, we had really low sulfate and chloride. But this technique over here, add all your sparging water minerals to the mash. This is a great technique that helps to boost the calcium content in your mash tun. And then because I'm using RO water to sparge with, and I'm just using straight RO water, no minerals in it, because I've added them to the to the mashing water. So I temporarily bumped all that the calcium salts to the mash. I can bump up the concentration, hopefully above 40 parts per million. Keep my sulfate low. And let's see, let's just do a real quick adjustment here. Let's see, try 0.2. I think that's not right. 5. And I'm still too much. Okay, let's get that 0.1. So now I've got those down where I want, but because and now concentrate over here, look over here while I toggle this unit back and forth. And you can see that when I do a normal addition, if I was going to add those minerals directly to the sparging water and mashing water, you know, my calcium content is way too low. But with this technique, you know, I can at least temporarily bump it up substantially. So it's worthwhile. Other techniques is add all your hardness minerals to the kettle. A lot of people like to do that, and that's fine. But of course, that has an effect on pH. So this at least gives you the opportunity to see what it's going to do for your mashing pH without minimizing your ability to add the kind of flavor ions that you want. And then there's the last item, add the calcium sulfate and calcium chloride to replace chalk and lime in your sparging water. For the most part, most people don't even bother with that. So it's just something to consider. The other good thing about this, the supporters version, is that you have the opportunity to use multiple acids. And for a lot of the people in England that use Bru'n Water, this is a great feature because a lot of them are dealing with very alkaline water, and they can't use like a single acid in order to get the kind of alkalinity reduction or neutralization that they need without then incurring flavor effects. So with the ability to add or use up to 4 different acids, that's a great technique. So you can avoid those flavor effects. Oh, okay. I see the people are chatting, and I'm hoping that I didn't have the chat box open, so I'm sorry about that. But hopefully that's good for you. And of course, with any of these acids, you can vary their strengths or the way that they're reported. For instance, you know, this is, you know, you can enter them in percentage, normality, molarity, or in some cases, some of these acids are solids. And with regard to some of the acids, especially with the popularity of New England IPAs, you know, there are acids that the more, or I should say less common brewing acids like citric acid, malic acid, tartaric. They have interesting flavor components that could actually be used to some decent effect. So, you know, this is a great tool here. So, like I said, grain bill input in the water adjustment tabs, you're going to be on these guys all the time. These other tabs, instructions, water input, and sparge acidification, you're going to hardly use them at all. And then over here, you've got an adjustment summary that at least, you know, if necessary, you can print this out and take it into the brew house with you so that you know, okay, yeah, I need to add, you know, 0.4 grams of gypsum to my mashing water and so on, you know, and the 0.4 grams of calcium chloride and whatever else you've got in there. And it also regurgitates the pH that you're targeting and the various water volumes that you input and hopefully you're actually using. And another advantage of the supporters version is that it also gives you a readout on the flavor effects for various acids that you might be using. And you know, for instance, lactic acid definitely has a flavor if you're adding it in sufficient quantities. And, you know, in a Berliner Weiss, you'll be perfectly fine with that. But if you're making a German Pils, I don't think you're going to be fine with it. So it's good to actually know what's going on here. So, and then one of the other nice features of the supporters version is that it allows you to save your water and batch inputs and outputs so that you can recall them, because I'm sure that, you know, you're brewing a new beer, but you know, you want to save that in case you ever brew it again. And at least with this, and this is one of the reasons why we do have macros in this version of Bru'n Water, is because I can save that information. And then with this guy, if I named this thing, I would have unique names for all the batches, and I could actually recall them and pull them up. And there's, I think, space for like 100 batches or something like that. And of course, you can just erase the name over here and it will overwrite your next batch in there. So you get to save and recall that stuff all in the same program. At least with the free version, you'd have to save that Excel file with a new name for every batch. So, you know, you're dealing with file after file after file, and you have to figure out where it is. Well, with the supporters version, they're all here. So it's a nice little thing to have. So let's get into some questions here. And I'm not sure if there are any questions in here or not, or if you guys were just talking amongst yourselves.
Referring to the chat, there were a few questions, and people were about what people were doing and things like that. But I think we should just sort of open it up and see what.
Yeah, go for it. Well, let me let's see. Let's get back into here. Let's go back to the this guy. Let's get this out of the way and back to slide review. Let's go. There we go. Okay. So, of course, we want simple when it comes to adjustments. A couple of guidances for simple water treatment. Remember that 1 Camden chaplet, which is either sodium or potassium metabisulfite, will typically remove the chlorine or chloramine from 20 gallons of water. So if you hopefully you are removing those components from your water because you don't like chlorophenols in your beers, unless you're a big Scotch drinker, I suppose. The other option is very slowly filtering your water through a carbon filter. One note, I noticed that for all your tap waters, they are all using chloramines. So honestly, a carbon filter will never, and I do mean never, work properly, because you have to, let's see, for the typical 10-inch filter canister, you're talking about 1/10 of a gallon per minute. So it's going to take you forever to get a filtered batch of water for your brewing. So forget about carbon filter in your area. Rely on the Camden tablet that'll be a much better result for you. And I'd like to reiterate, these mineral additions, they can be approximate, so in Bru'n Water or any other program, they're saying, oh, well, you need, the target is, 45 parts per million sulfate. Don't pull your hair out trying to get it to exactly 45. Get it plus or minus 10. That's close enough. The only one that you really need to worry about is magnesium, because that can, after about 20 or 30 parts per million, you might be running into trouble. So you do need to keep that within limit. But for pretty much everything else, approximate is okay. Of course, the one thing that you really will want to dial in relatively precisely is getting that pH very close to whatever target you're going to target, and I do recommend, at least for starting, for typical beers, 5.4 is really good. For roasty beers, 5.6 is really good. So start from there. Okay, and remember that simple adjustments can make a big difference in your beers, and probably that the most simple adjustment that you really need to pay attention to is pH. That will make a huge difference. So you know how to make pour beer. Use pour malt or use stale hops or sick yeast, but you can add one more to that, use untreated water. So if you're interested in great beer, make sure that you got all the best malt, hops, and yeast, but also make sure that you're doing a good job of getting the water where it needs to be for the batch at hand. So even good tasting water can send your beer quality down the drain. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's have some questions.
All right. Questions for Martin?
I've got one of them. Oh, sorry. I don't know if anyone else is talking. Hey, Martin. So back when you were talking about the malts, so where should we cut off, I guess, crystal versus base malt? For instance, like there are crystal malts that are, 15 Lovibond, but then if you're using like Munich 2, which is going to be darker than 15 Lovibond, should we consider that just as a base?
Correct. Munich, Vienna. But Andy, how do I get this thing to stop sharing?
You should be able to stop share. Can you?
Oh, here it is. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
There you
go. So yes. So grains like wheat malt, base malt, Pils malt, pale malt, Munich, Vienna. Those are all base malts. Even dark Munich is still a base malt, and it tends to have it has just a slightly different slope than the crystal malts. But if you were to select crystal or base, the curves are really not that different. So it's not a big deal. But things like Special B or, Crystal 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 120, whatever, those are crystals. The confusing grains that are kind of confounding me, I'm sure many of you have heard of amber malts, and at least with the many of the British maltsters, those amber malts actually they display sort of a roasty acidity, even though they're not that dark, but they still display the kind of acidity. So I don't know what to tell you about what you should enter them as. Hopefully, the good thing is that you're probably not adding them in that great a quantity. So, if we get their acidity off a little bit, it's probably not going to kill your pH prediction. But, you know, that's one of those things that I really haven't deciphered yet. So I apologize.
Good. Thank you.
A question.
I have a question. You know, I've noticed, so, you know, I'm not a big fan of hazy IPAs, but I think that's due to water. There's a lot of people that make these, like, you know, hazy IPAs all over the place now. And I think the best one I've ever had was called Julius. And I've noticed the water is really soft and kind of malt centric, and it doesn't have that harsh chlorophenol that sometimes appears in those hazy beers. So do you want to talk about that and why this sort of almost, it almost has this calcium chloride heavy thing that kind of makes it smooth and almost like a oatmeal stout kind of vibe to it. So
very full. Well, first of all, I prefer not to use the terms malty or bitter, though they are not good descriptors. The proper terms are dry and full, and calcium or chloride adds to fullness. And if you review the water profile listing in Bru'n Water, there is a New England IPA profile, and I think that it's something like 150 parts per million chloride and about 75 parts per million sulfate. You know, people have done a lot of work with those profiles. I just adopted it, but there's strong indications that, you know, getting the chloride upwards of that level does the proper job of making the full mouthfeel that's really important for that style. But along with that, having that modest amount of sulfate in there is also an important aspect, just to help dry the finish just a little bit so that it's just right. And of course, having the right pH, you know, as we already pointed out, you know, if you're, one of the problems with adding big charges of hops is that they tend to drive the pH of the beer higher. So for that reason, you might actually need to, you know, target a lower lower mash pH, and that might, well, let me start over again. You do want your mashing pH to still fall in the proper range, probably 5.3 to 5.4, because you'll get excessive proteolysis if you shoot for 5.2, and you'll end up with a thinner beer. And at least in New England IPA, you do want that, you know, that body. So in that case, I've got the feeling that you will actually get a benefit from doing either a post fermentation or a post boil acid addition to drive, you know, so you've kind of targeted that 5.3, 5.4 range. And then once you're out of the mash and into the boil, or actually probably post boil, then you might want to drive the pH down another couple of tenths. And of course, because you're still dealing with wort as opposed to beer, the pH adjustment capability of Bru'n Water is still valid. So you say, okay, I've got 5 gallons of wort here. I need to. I want to reserve a bit of acid so that I can drive the pH down another 0.2. So, you know, you can, in essence, play with Bru'n Water and figure out what that dose is for that batch of beer and drive that pH down after the fact to help make up for the pH raising tendency of big hop charges. And, you know, as I pointed out, high pH tends to pull out chlorophenol, or I'm sorry, polyphenols from the hop matter, and that's where that green flavor comes from. So that's one way to help avoid that.
Other questions?
In the water profile adjustment calculator, there are two lines, one that says mashing water profile and the next says overall finished water profile. Is the mashing water profile what you'd expect is in your mash tun as you're adding before you add your grains, and then the overall finished, is that what you'd expect in the kettle?
No. So remember I had that toggle so that you could add, you know, all your minerals to the mashing water instead of the sparging water, or both, I should say. So because I added that toggle, I needed to actually see what the mashing water PR content was. So that really is only going to be effective when you're using that little toggle and doing all your mash, you know, all the minerals to the mashing water, and then you're in essence diluting it down with the sparging water. So you should see that the mashing water profile is high, and then the overall profile should be lower, because more than like you're adding, you know, mineral free sparging water, or less mineralized sparging water.
Thank you.
So that's what that is.
Other questions?
Got another one. So what are the chances of you ever turning it into software instead of just an Excel file? Have you considered it?
I have considered it, and I could program that, but unfortunately, well, the real goal would be to port it to, you know, your phone so that you could do something with that. That is well beyond my programming skills. So it's just a dream.
So,
But
Mark,
of course,
I have
you
a
know,
question.
within Excel, it's all just a bunch of equations.
I have a question for you, Martin. So how, you know, you mentioned that there were people in England using the program. How many people are using your spreadsheet in what parts of the world?
Oh God, well, okay. So there's a bunch of Argentinians, Brazilians, Mexico. There are some Spaniards. As a matter of fact, we just released a Spanish language version of Bru'n Water. A couple of Argentinian brewers worked with me to port that over, because that was a great deal of work. There are a lot of English. There's a few French. And of course, that's just with the supporters. I have no idea how many people are using the free version. I mean, I'm sure that's been probably downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. You know, they say that in the US alone, there's on the order of 1 million homebrewers. I don't know that all of them would be dealing with water, but I would say at least 10 or 20%. So, you know, easily a couple of 100,000 people are dealing with some water software of some form.
100,000 people, that's enough to win an election somewhere. So, you know, just so everybody knows here, we're going to raffle off 3 copies of the supporters version. So, you know, after the presentation's done. So after the presentation's done, we answer all the questions here. Don't leave because you won't want to miss out on that.
Well, folks, it's getting late here. Any other questions?
What's your current version number? 5.5?
5.5.
Last question. If anybody has a last question for Martin, this would be a good time.
Folks, it's good to see you all. Enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. I realize that at least a little bit of it was probably something you already saw, because I'm sure that all of you were in San Diego, because that was a hell of a time. I was really sad that we didn't have you know, our homebrew con this year, and hopefully we'll have one next year, but I won't be able to make it to San Diego this coming summer.
Well, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time out to discuss water with us. So we really appreciate it. This has been a great part of our educational program, and
appreciate it.
We look forward to a lot more of our brewers, you know, being, you know, a lot more precise with their water in the coming beers that we're going to get to sample.
Good thing.
All right. Thank you, Martin.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so for everybody else, we're doing backwards program here. So we're going to jump into the main discussion and go, you know, sort of backwards from there, from where we started. But I think what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to say, let's take a 5-minute break just so people can go get another beer, go fill up, because I know I'm pretty empty right here. We'll fill up our beers. We're going to go through and I'm going to share the screen so you can see what we're going to cover right here. But we should, here, let's see if we can see all this. So this is the plan, really. We're going to cover, we're going to talk about the upcoming meeting plan. We already did the Bru'n Water. We're going to do a wrap up on the 2020 Funk Up. We're going to do a drawing for a supporters version of Bru'n Water. We're going to talk about beers at the Social Homebrew Exchange. We're going to talk about the upcoming meeting plan. And hopefully if you guys have had enough beer by then, we're going to do officers elections. So let's do this. Let's take 5 minutes, go fill up your beer, come on back, and we'll jump right into the program.